Let me tell you something that most Christians are afraid to say out loud. Church can destroy you. Not the world. Not the devil. Not some great philosophical crisis. The very place that was supposed to be your refuge, your family, your safe ground. That place can rip your heart out and leave you bleeding on the floor while everyone around you keeps singing with their hands raised like nothing happened. My name is Alex Miller. I am 29 years old. I live in Seattle. I work as a UX designer for a tech company that pays me more money than I ever thought I would see in my life. I drive a nice car. I have a nice apartment. I eat at nice restaurants. And for the last 10 years, I have lived as if God does not exist. Not because I sat down one day and carefully reasoned my way out of faith. Not because I read some brilliant atheist philosopher who dismantled my belief system with logic. No, I walked away from God because the people who claimed to represent Him turned out to be the worst liars I had ever met in my life. And I will tell you something else. For 10 years, every single time someone mentioned the word church, every single time someone invited me to a service, every single time I heard a worship song playing in a coffee shop or leaking out of someone's car window, my stomach turned, physically turned, like the feeling you get when you smell food that once gave you food poisoning. Your body remembers the sickness even when your mind tries to forget. That is what Christianity became for me, a sickness I was trying to forget. I was 19 years old when everything fell apart. 19. I was not some casual churchgoer who showed up on Easter and Christmas. I was all in. I was the kid who got saved at 13 and immediately started telling everyone at school about Jesus. I was the teenager who brought his guitar to youth group and played until his fingers bled because he believed that worship was the most important thing a human being could do. By the time I was 17, I was leading worship at one of the largest churches in the Pacific Northwest. 2,000 people every Sunday morning, full production, LED walls, haze machines, in-ear monitors, a green room with snacks and bottled water. I thought I was standing on holy ground. I thought these people, these pastors, these leaders, these elders were the closest thing to the apostles that existed in modern times. I would have done anything for them. I would have given my life for that church. And that is exactly why what happened next nearly killed me. It was a Tuesday night. I remember that because Tuesdays were when the worship team rehearsed. I showed up early like I always did. I liked to pray in the sanctuary before anyone else arrived. The lights were off. The room was enormous and silent. And I loved that silence. It felt like God was closer in the silence than He was during the loudest, most electric moments of Sunday worship. I walked down the hallway toward the sound booth to drop off my guitar case, and that is when I heard voices coming from behind the senior pastor's office door. The door was not fully closed. It was cracked open just enough, and I heard words that I will never be able to unhear for as long as I live. I heard the executive pastor, a man I called a spiritual father, talking about how to keep the congregation from finding out about Pastor David's affair. Not just an affair that had been going on for over 2 years, with a woman in the worship team. A woman I knew. A woman whose husband sat in the front row every single Sunday with their 2 little girls. And that was not all. I heard numbers, dollar amounts, exposed donations being rerouted, a building fund that did not exist. I stood in that hallway with my guitar case in my hand, and I felt the floor fall out from under my feet. I could not breathe. I could not think. My hands were shaking. I set the case down quietly and I walked back out of that building into the parking lot. And I sat in my car for 2 hours in the dark. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just sat there, numb, like someone had reached inside my chest and pulled something vital out and I had not yet realized I was supposed to be dead. The next day, I went to one of the elders, a man I trusted. I told him what I heard. I told him everything. And do you know what he said to me? He put his hand on my shoulder and he looked me in the eye. And he said, "Alex, sometimes God calls us to cover the nakedness of our fathers, like the sons of Noah. Obedience comes before understanding. Submission comes before questioning. Trust the process. Trust the process." That is what he said to me. Trust the process. As if the systematic deception of 2,000 people was a process that deserved trust. As if a pastor sleeping with a married woman while preaching about holiness every Sunday was something God wanted me to quietly accept. As if hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from people who tithed out of genuine faith and sacrifice was just an administrative hiccup that the leadership would sort out internally. I did not trust the process. I walked away. I walked away from that church. I walked away from every church. I walked away from worship. I walked away from prayer. I walked away from the Bible that had been my constant companion since I was 13 years old. I walked away from God Himself. Or at least I thought I did. Because here is the part of the story that I did not expect. Here is the part that I am still trying to make sense of even now. 10 years later, God came looking for me, and He did not find me in a megachurch. He did not find me through a famous preacher or a best-selling book or a viral sermon clip. He found me in a town so small it does not even show up on most maps, in a church so tiny that the entire congregation could fit in my apartment living room, through the words of people so ordinary that the world would never give them a Christ's sake. This is that story. And if you have ever been hurt by the church, if you have ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to represent God, if you have ever looked at the ceiling at 3 in the morning and whispered into the darkness, were you ever even real? Then I need you to stay with me. Because what happened in that small town in Kansas did not just change my mind about God. It broke me completely. In the best possible way. I need to take you back to before the hurt. Because if you do not understand what that church meant to me, you will never understand why losing it almost destroyed me. I was 13 years old the first time I walked into New Horizon Community Church. My mom had been invited by a coworker. We were not a church family. My dad had left when I was 9. Mom worked 2 jobs. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Seattle, and most Sundays we spent watching TV and eating cereal because that was the only day neither of us had anywhere to be. But her coworker kept inviting her. And one Sunday morning in October she finally said yes. I remember walking through those doors and feeling something I had never felt before. It was not just the music, though the music was incredible. A full band. Lights moving across the ceiling. A sound so big it vibrated in your chest. It was not just the building, though the building was massive and modern and felt like a place where important things happened. It was the people. A man at the door shook my hand and looked me in the eye and said, "We have been waiting for you, buddy." A woman handed me a donut and told me she was glad I was there. A group of kids my age waved me over and made space for me like I had always been one of them. For a 13-year-old kid with no father and no real sense of belonging, that feeling was like water in a desert. I did not know it was God at the time. I just knew I wanted to come back. Within a month, I gave my life to Jesus at a youth retreat. Within 3 months, I was volunteering every week. Within a year, I had taught myself guitar specifically so I could play on the youth worship team. And within 2 years, I was one of the most visible young leaders in the entire church. I loved it. I loved every single second of it. The early morning prayer meetings, the late night worship sessions, the Bible studies where I would fill entire notebooks with things I was learning, the mission trips where I would see God move in ways that made my faith feel bulletproof. I believed, with every cell in my body, that God was real, that He loved me, that He had a plan for my life, and that this specific church was the vehicle He had chosen to carry out that plan. Pastor David was the center of it all. He was charismatic, brilliant, funny, the kind of speaker who could hold 2,000 people in the palm of his hand for 45 minutes without anyone reaching for their phone. He had a way of making you feel like he was talking directly to you, even in a room full of thousands. He called me son. He told me he saw something special in me. He said God had big plans for my life and that He wanted to be part of helping me fulfill them. When he said those things, I believed him completely because I wanted a father. And he knew that. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. He knew exactly what I needed to hear. He knew the empty spaces inside me that were shaped like a father's voice, a father's approval, a father's presence. And He filled those spaces with words that sounded like love but were really just tools. Tools to build loyalty. Tools to ensure silence. Tools to create a culture where questioning the leader was the same as questioning God Himself. But I could not see any of that at 19. At 19, I saw a man of God, a shepherd, a hero. And when I heard those voices behind that cracked office door, when I heard the truth about who He really was, it did not just break my trust in Him. It broke something fundamental in my understanding of reality. Because if this man who baptized me, who laid hands on me and prayed over my life, who stood on that stage every Sunday and spoke with such authority about holiness and integrity and the character of God, if this man was a fraud, then what did that say about everything he ever taught me? What did that say about every sermon I had absorbed? Every moment I thought I felt the Holy Spirit? Every prayer that seemed to be answered? Was any of it real? Was God just a story that broken people tell themselves to survive? Was the whole thing, every worship song, every altar call, every tear I shed at that altar, was it all just emotional manipulation by a man who knew how to work a room? These questions did not come quietly. They did not arrive one at a time in orderly fashion so I could examine them carefully. They crashed into me all at once like a wave, and I went under. In the weeks after I confronted the elder, things got worse. Word spread that I was asking questions, that I was causing trouble. One by one, the people I thought were my family began to distance themselves from me. Friends I had served with for years stopped returning my calls. Leaders who had mentored me suddenly had no time for me. And then the narrative shifted. I was not a concerned young man trying to do the right thing. I was a rebellious spirit. I was prideful. I was listening to the enemy. I was dangerous. One Sunday, the youth pastor pulled me aside and told me it would be better if I stepped back from the worship team for a while, just until things settled down. he said. His eyes would not meet mine, and I understood. This was not a pause. This was a punishment. I was being punished for telling the truth. I was being silenced for refusing to pretend. And the people who were supposed to protect me, the people who had told me for 6 years that I was family, they all stood by and watched it happen. Some of them participated. The last time I set foot in New Horizon Community Church, I was 19 years and 4 months old. I walked in during a Wednesday night service. The room was full. Pastor David was on stage, preaching about integrity. Integrity. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. Almost. But I did not laugh. I stood in the back of that auditorium and I looked at 2,000 people hanging on every word of a man who was lying to their faces, and I felt something inside me die. Not anger. I had already passed through anger. This was something colder. Something final. It was the death of belief. Not just belief in Pastor David. Not just belief in that church. Belief in the entire framework. Belief that there was a God who cared. Belief that the Bible was anything more than a human book full of human ideas. Belief that prayer reached anyone or anything beyond the ceiling of whatever room you happened to be standing in. I turned around. I walked out. I got in my car. And I drove away from God. For 10 years. 10 years. Do you know how long 10 years is when you are running? Every single day is a decision. Every single day you wake up and you choose, again, not to believe, not to pray, not to hope. And at first it feels like freedom. It really does. At first it feels like you have taken off a heavy coat that you did not even realize was weighing you down. You can sleep in on Sundays. You can stop feeling guilty about things that do not matter. You can stop performing for a God who apparently does not hold his own representatives to the standards he demands of everyone else. Freedom. That is what I called it for the first few years. But freedom has a way of getting quiet. And in the quiet, you start to hear things you have been trying to drown out. A still, small voice that sounds suspiciously like the one you have been running from. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before God found me, I had to hit bottom. And my bottom did not look like most people's bottom. My bottom looked, from the outside, like a perfectly successful life. And that made it so much harder to admit that I was drowning. People imagine that when you walk away from God, your life falls apart immediately. They picture some dramatic downward spiral: drugs, crime, homelessness, rock bottom in a gutter somewhere. And for some people, maybe that is how it goes. But for me, the collapse was invisible. From the outside, my life after church looked better than it ever had before. I threw myself into work. I had always been creative, always been a visual thinker, and I channeled all the energy that used to go into worship and ministry into building a career. I went to community college, transferred to the University of Washington, got a degree in design, and landed a job at a tech startup before I even graduated. Within 5 years, I was a senior UX designer at one of the biggest companies in Seattle. I was making 6 figures. I had a corner desk with a view of the Puget Sound. I had colleagues who respected me, projects that challenged me, and a lifestyle that most 20-somethings would envy. I dated. I traveled. I went to concerts and art galleries and weekend trips to Portland and Vancouver. I filled my calendar so completely that there was never a single empty hour where silence could creep in. And for a while, it worked. For a while, the noise was loud enough to cover the ache. But the ache was always there. It lived in a place I could not reach. Somewhere behind my ribs, below my thoughts, in a space that no amount of career success or social activity or Netflix binges could touch. It was not depression exactly. I had enough self-awareness to monitor myself for that. It was more like a low-grade homesickness. A constant, dull awareness that I was far from a place I used to belong, and I could not go back, and I could not find anywhere else that felt like home. The insomnia started around year 3. I would lie in bed at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through an endless loop of thoughts that never resolved. What is the point? Why am I doing any of this? What happens when I die? Is this all there is? Just work and eat and sleep and try to be entertained enough to not notice that none of it means anything. I tried everything. Meditation apps, sleep podcasts, exercise routines, therapy, which actually helped with some things, but could not touch the deepest layer of what was wrong. Because what was wrong was not psychological, it was spiritual, and I would have rather died than admitted that. One night in year 7, I remember it was a Thursday in February because it had been raining for 11 straight days, which even for Seattle was excessive. I could not sleep. Again, I got up and went to the kitchen for water. On the way back to bed, I stubbed my toe on the nightstand and knocked the drawer open. I reached down to close it and my hand touched something that sent a jolt through my body like I had grabbed a live wire. It was a notebook. A small, spiral-bound notebook with a blue cover, soft and worn from years of handling. I knew what it was before I even opened it. I had not seen it in years. I did not even know it was in that drawer. It must have followed me through 4 apartment moves like a stowaway. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened it, and the first page nearly stopped my heart. In the handwriting of a 15-year-old boy, my handwriting, but from a version of me that felt like a completely different person, were lyrics, worship lyrics, song fragments, prayers written in the margins, verses copied out in careful letters with underlines and stars and exclamation points. God, you are so faithful. I will never stop praising you. No matter what happens, I will worship you forever. I read those words and something cracked. Not broke. Not yet. Just cracked. A hairline fracture in the wall I had spent 7 years building between myself and the person I used to be. I closed the notebook. I shoved it back in the drawer. I went back to bed. And I did not sleep for the rest of the night. Underneath that notebook, I would later discover, was my old Bible, a leather-bound NIV that my mom had given me for my 14th birthday. It was stuffed with bookmarks and highlighted in 4 different colors, and the spine was so broken from use that it barely held together. I did not touch it that night. I could not. It would be 3 more years before I opened it again. And when I finally did, it would be in a place I never expected, surrounded by people I never imagined, in circumstances that only God could have arranged. But during those silent 10 years, something else was happening that I was completely unaware of. While I was running, while I was building my walls higher, while I was constructing an identity that had no room for faith, God was setting pieces in motion. Pieces that would not make sense until much later. People were praying for me. My mother, who had found her own quiet faith at a small church across town, prayed for me every single day for 10 years. Every single day. She never pushed. She never preached at me. She never sent me Bible verses or guilt-tripped me about not going to church. She just prayed. And she waited. And she loved me exactly as I was. There was also Sarah. Sarah Mitchell had been on the worship team with me at New Horizon. She was 2 years older, and she had been like a big sister to me during those intense years of ministry. When everything fell apart, she was one of the few people who did not turn on me. She called me a few times in the first year, but I was so angry and so wounded that I pushed her away like I pushed everyone else away. She stopped calling, but she did not stop praying. And she did not stop believing that God was not finished with my story. The silent years were not actually silent. That is what I understand now. They felt silent to me because I had stopped listening. But heaven was not silent. Heaven was working, moving pieces across a board I could not see, preparing a place I did not know existed, preparing my heart for a breaking it did not yet know it needed. Year 8. Year 9. The ache grew louder. The insomnia grew worse. The success grew emptier. I started turning down social invitations. I started spending weekends alone in my apartment, staring at screens without seeing what was on them. I stopped caring about the projects at work that used to excite me. My therapist said it sounded like an existential crisis. She was right. But it was more than that. It was a soul crying out for something it had been denied for almost a decade. And I was so stubborn, so wounded, so terrified of being hurt again, that I would not give it what it needed. I would not even name what it needed. And then, in year 10, on a random Wednesday afternoon in March, my phone rang, and the name on the screen was one I had not seen in almost a decade. Sarah Mitchell. I almost did not answer. I stared at her name on my screen for 4 rings, and every ring felt like a question I was not ready to be asked. Why now? Why after all this time? What could she possibly want? On the 5th ring, right before it would have gone to voicemail, my thumb moved on its own. I cannot explain it any other way. My brain was saying let it go, but my thumb pressed the green button. And suddenly her voice was in my ear for the first time in nearly 10 years, and it sounded exactly the same. Warm, steady, like someone who had never once been in a hurry. Alex, she said. My heart did something strange. It lurched, like a car engine turning over after sitting unused in a cold garage for years. Just hearing someone say my name in that tone, that specific tone that carried the memory of who I used to be, was almost too much. Hey, Sarah, I said, and my voice came out thinner than I wanted it to. There was a pause. Not an awkward pause. A full pause. The kind of pause that holds weight because the person on the other end is choosing their words carefully. I know this is out of nowhere, she said, and I know you probably have a whole life that has nothing to do with anything we used to be part of. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say no. I sat down on my couch. My apartment was quiet. The rain was tapping against the window the way it always does in Seattle, like the city itself has a pulse. Go ahead, I said. She told me about a church. A small church in a town called Millbrook, Kansas. Population just over 800 people. The church had been there for almost 90 years. Same building, same foundation. A white wooden structure with a simple steeple and a parking lot that was mostly gravel. The kind of church you drive past on a highway and barely notice. Sarah had ended up there through a series of events that she described as either coincidence or providence, depending on your worldview. After leaving New Horizon, she had gone through her own crisis of faith. She had wandered for a few years, ended up doing mission work in Central America, and eventually connected with a small network of churches in the rural Midwest that were doing quiet, unglamorous, boots-on-the-ground ministry. She had been helping the Millbrook Church for about 2 years now, and they had a problem. The church was old. The congregation was aging. They had almost no online presence, no way to reach younger people in the surrounding area, and their building needed significant updates. They had received a small grant to renovate the worship space and install a basic media system. Nothing fancy, just enough to live stream their services and create some simple content for outreach. But nobody in the congregation knew how to do any of it. They needed someone with technical and design skills to come out for a few weeks, assess what they needed, help them set it up, and train someone to maintain it. "Alex," she said, "I know this is not your world anymore. I know you walked away from all of it. But this is not about theology or doctrine or any of that. This is a practical job. They have a budget. They will pay you. You would be doing freelance consulting work for a small organization that needs help. That is all." I was quiet for a long time. She waited. She did not fill the silence with persuasion or pressure. She just waited. I want to be honest about what was going through my mind. I was not thinking about God. I was not feeling some mysterious spiritual pull. I was thinking about money and timing. My company had just gone through a round of layoffs. I had survived, but the work environment had become toxic and draining. I had accumulated enough PTO to take 3 weeks off, and I had been thinking about getting away somewhere, anywhere, just to breathe. And here was an offer that included a paycheck, a change of scenery, and a finite timeline. 3 weeks. In and out. Help some nice old people figure out how to use a projector and a laptop, then fly back to Seattle and resume my regularly scheduled existential crisis. "What is the pay?" I asked. She told me. It was modest but fair. It would more than cover my expenses and leave some extra. "When do they need me?" I asked. "As soon as possible," she said. "I will think about it," I said. I thought about it for 6 hours. During those 6 hours, I told myself a dozen different stories about why I was considering this. I needed a break. I wanted to see a different part of the country. The money was easy. The work was simple. I was doing a favor for an old friend. All of those things were true, but none of them were the real reason. The real reason was hiding underneath all the rational explanations like a seed buried in frozen ground. The real reason was that somewhere in the deepest, most sealed-off chamber of my heart, a tiny flame that I had spent 10 years trying to extinguish was still burning, and it flickered when Sarah said the word church. I booked the flight to Kansas City for the following Tuesday. From there, it was a 3-hour drive to Millbrook. Sarah offered to pick me up. I told her I would rent a car. I wanted the option to leave whenever I wanted. I wanted an escape route. I wanted to be in control. Money got me on that plane. Practicality got me in that rental car. Professional obligation got me driving down that long, flat Kansas highway with cornfields stretching out to the horizon in every direction. The sky so enormous it made Seattle feel like a closet. But God had a different reason for getting me to Millbrook. A reason I would not understand until a tornado, a child's question, and a letter hidden inside a hymnal conspired to tear down every wall I had spent a decade building. As I drove, I passed a road sign that said Millbrook, 12 miles. And I felt something I had not felt in 10 years. I felt afraid. Not afraid of the town. Not afraid of the people. Afraid of myself. Afraid of what might happen if the ice inside me started to thaw. Afraid of what might be living underneath it. I almost turned the car around 3 times in those 12 miles. 3 times. But I did not. Something would not let me. Call it stubbornness. Call it curiosity. Call it the prayers of a mother who had not missed a single day in 10 years. Call it whatever you want. I call it grace. Because that is what it was. Even though I did not recognize it yet. Grace disguised as a freelance gig. Grace wearing the mask of practicality. Grace waiting for me at the end of a gravel road in a town most people have never heard of, in a church smaller than the green room I used to prepare in before leading worship for thousands. I pulled into the parking lot at 4:17 in the afternoon. The sun was low and golden. The church was smaller than I had imagined. White paint peeling in places. A wooden cross on the steeple that leaned slightly to the left. A hand-painted sign out front that said, "Welcome to Grace Fellowship. All are welcome. All are loved." And standing on the front steps, waiting for me with a paper cup of coffee in her hand and a smile that had not changed in 10 years, was Sarah. She did not hug me right away. She could see it in my face, the guard, the distance, the do not touch me energy I had perfected over a decade of keeping everyone at arm's length. She just handed me the coffee and said, "I am glad you are here, Alex." I took the coffee. I looked at the tiny church. I looked at the cornfields. I looked at the sky, which was turning pink and orange and purple in a way that Seattle skies never do because there is always too much cloud cover. And I thought, 3 weeks. I can survive anything for 3 weeks. God, as it turns out, can do a lot in 3 weeks. The first thing I noticed about Grace Fellowship was a silence. Not an empty silence. Not the hollow quiet of a room where nothing is happening. This was a full silence. A lived-in silence. The kind of silence that exists in a place where people have been praying for almost a century, where the walls themselves seem to hold the accumulated weight of 10,000 whispered conversations with God. I walked through the front door and the smell hit me before anything else. Old wood, lemon polish, coffee that had been sitting on a warmer too long. And underneath all of that, something I can only describe as warmth, even though warmth is not technically a smell. The sanctuary was small, maybe 40 pews, divided by a center aisle. The wood was dark and scratched and worn smooth by decades of hands gripping the edges during prayer. The carpet was thin and faded, a pattern that might have been maroon once but had surrendered to a tired pink. The windows were plain glass, not stained, and they let in the late afternoon light without any filter or drama. Just light, just sun, just the world outside, visible and close. At the front, there was a simple wooden pulpit. No plexiglass, no teleprompter mount, no monitor embedded in the top so the pastor could read his notes without looking down. Just a wooden pulpit with a Bible on it. Behind the pulpit, mounted on the wall, was a wooden cross. Not decorative, not artistic, not backlit or surrounded by an Instagram-worthy design. Just two pieces of wood, joined together, hanging on a wall. I stood in the center aisle and I thought about the last church I had been in. The LED walls that could display any image in the world. The lighting rig that cost more than most people's houses. The sound system designed by engineers who also worked on concert tours for major recording artists. The fog machines. The moving lights. The countdown timers. The pre-service hype reels. This church had none of that. This church had a cross and some pews and the smell of old coffee. And standing in that tiny, unremarkable room, I felt something I did not expect. I felt safe, which made me immediately angry at myself, because I did not want to feel anything. "You must be Alex." The voice came from behind me. I turned around and there was a man in his early 60s, medium height, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His face was weathered in the way that faces get when they spend most of their time outdoors. His eyes were kind but not soft. There was a steadiness in them, a groundedness, like a man who had seen hard things and chosen not to be hardened by them. He extended his hand. "I'm Pastor Tom Whitfield. Welcome to Millbrook." His handshake was firm but not aggressive. He did not hold on too long. He did not pull me in for one of those forced bro hugs that church leaders love to do. He just shook my hand, looked me in the eye, and let go. "Sarah tells me you are the one who is going to drag us into the 21st century, he said with a small smile. "I will do my best," I said. He nodded. "Let me show you around. It will not take long." He was right. It did not take long. The church consisted of the sanctuary, a small office that doubled as a storage room, a kitchen that was clean but ancient, a fellowship hall with folding tables and metal chairs, and a basement that smelled like damp concrete and held the church's emergency supplies. The media system I had been brought in to help with was, at that point, a projector that was at least 15 years old, a laptop that ran Windows so slowly it seemed to be doing it on purpose, and a portable speaker that someone had bought at a big box store and duct taped to a shelf near the front. "That is our sound system," Pastor Tom said, pointing to the duct-taped speaker. He said it without embarrassment, without apology, without the defensive self-deprecation that people sometimes use when they know their resources are limited. He said it the way you would say the sky is blue. Just a fact. I looked at the speaker and I looked at him and I said, "I can work with this." Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. Sarah had arranged for me to stay in a small guest cottage behind the home of Margaret and Earl Dawson, a couple in their mid-70s who had been members of Grace Fellowship for over 50 years. The cottage was one room with a bed, a desk, a tiny bathroom, and a window that looked out over a field where cows grazed in the morning mist. It was, without exaggeration, the quietest place I had ever been in my life. I woke up each morning and drove the 4 minutes to the church. Everything in Millbrook was 4 minutes from everything else and spent the day assessing the infrastructure, making plans, ordering equipment, and beginning the renovation of the small tech setup that would allow the church to live stream and create basic content. The work was straightforward. I was good at it. And I was grateful for it because it gave me something to focus on that was not the growing, unsettling awareness that this place was doing something to me. I could not name it yet. I did not want to name it. But every day, it got a little harder to maintain the professional distance I had promised myself I would keep. Because the people of Millbrook would not let me be a stranger. Every morning when I arrived at the church, there was fresh coffee waiting. Not from a machine. Brewed by hand by Margaret Dawson, who drove over before sunrise every single day to make sure there was a hot pot ready for whoever needed it. She had been doing this for 31 years. 31 years of waking up early to make coffee for other people. When I asked her why, She looked at me like the question itself was strange. "Because people need coffee in the morning, honey," she said. And then she handed me a plate of biscuits she had also made from scratch, and walked away to set up the fellowship hall for the Tuesday morning Bible study that she had been leading since before I was born. And it was not just Margaret. It was everyone. Every single person I met in that church lived their faith in a way that I had never actually witnessed before. Not performed it, lived it. And the difference between those two things, I was beginning to realize, was the difference between everything I had known and everything I had been missing. I had planned to keep to myself, do the job, be polite but distant, eat my meals alone, spend my evenings in the guest cottage working on my laptop or watching something on my phone. 3 weeks of professional, arm's-length interaction, and then back to Seattle, back to my life. Back to the comfortable numbness I had mistaken for peace. Millbrook had other plans. It started with breakfast. On my third morning, I was sitting in the church kitchen eating a granola bar when a man named James walked in carrying a casserole dish covered in foil. He was maybe 35, tall, with the kind of lean, sun-darkened build that comes from physical work, not a gym membership. He set the dish on the counter and said, "My wife made this for you. It is her brisket hash. Best you will ever have. Before you say you are fine, I should tell you she will be offended if it comes back full, and you do not want Linda offended." I ate the brisket hash. It was, in fact, the best I ever had. And that was the end of my plan to eat alone, because from that morning on, someone in the congregation brought me food every single day. Not because Sarah had asked them to. Not because Pastor Tom had organized a meal train. Just because that is what they did. A stranger was among them. And strangers get fed. It is that simple. It is that biblical. And it is that rare. Over the next 2 weeks, I was pulled into the daily life of Millbrook almost against my will. James invited me to help at his family's farm one Saturday. I spent 6 hours hauling hay bales and fixing a fence line, and by the end of it my back was destroyed and my hands were raw. But I had laughed more than I had laughed in months. Real laughter. The kind that comes from physical exhaustion and shared effort. And the simple pleasure of doing something tangible with your hands instead of staring at pixels on a screen all day. There was a couple named David and Maria Hernandez. They were in their mid-40s. And every weekday afternoon they opened their home to children from low-income families in the surrounding area. Not a formal program. Not a nonprofit with a board of directors and a tax exemption and a logo. Just their living room, their kitchen table, their time. Kids came after school and did homework while Maria helped them with math and David made grilled cheese sandwiches. Some of those kids came from homes where there was no food in the refrigerator. Some came from homes where nobody asked about their homework or their day or their life. At the Hernandez house, every child was asked, every child was fed, and every child was told, before they left, that God loved them, and so did David and Maria. I watched this happen on a Tuesday afternoon. I had gone to their house to set up a small camera for a testimonial video. I ended up staying for 3 hours. I sat at the kitchen table with a 7-year-old girl named Lily who was struggling with reading. She was trying to sound out the word beautiful and getting frustrated, and I helped her work through it letter by letter until she got it. And when she got it, her face lit up like a sunrise. And Maria caught my eye across the room and smiled, and in that smile was something that said, "You see? This is what it looks like. This is what it actually looks like." Then there was Earl, Margaret's husband, 76 years old, bad knees, a truck that was older than me and twice as stubborn. Every Thursday morning, Earl drove 45 minutes to the state penitentiary in Hutchinson. He had been doing this for 22 years. He sat with inmates. He listened to their stories. He did not preach at them. He did not hand out tracts. He just sat with them and listened, and, when they asked, he told them about a God who loved them even in their worst moments. Some of those men had done terrible things. Things that would make most people recoil. Earl did not recoil. Earl just kept showing up. 22 years. Every Thursday. Rain or shine. Good health or bad. I asked him once why he did it. He was quiet for a moment, the way people in Millbrook tended to be quiet before they spoke, as if they were checking their words against some internal standard before releasing them. "Because somebody sat with me once," he said, "when I was in a dark place, and it saved my life. So I sit with others." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The Sunday after my first week in Millbrook, I attended the service. Not because I wanted to. Because Sarah asked, and it would have been awkward to refuse, given that I was literally living on church property and eating food prepared by church members. I sat in the back pew. I crossed my arms. I kept my face neutral. I was there as an observer, a professional assessing the technical needs of the worship service. Nothing more. Pastor Tom preached from the book of James, chapter 1, verse 22. Do not merely listen to the word, and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. In a megachurch, that verse would have been accompanied by a 3-point outline, a clever acronym, a personal anecdote polished to a shine, and a powerful emotional crescendo designed to drive people to the altar. Pastor Tom did not do any of that. He opened his Bible, he read the passage, and then he talked about it like he was sitting at a kitchen table with friends. He talked about how easy it is to hear the right words and nod along and feel good about yourself, and then go home and live exactly the same way you lived before. He talked about how faith that does not change the way you treat people is not faith at all, it is just religious entertainment. He talked about James's challenge to care for orphans and widows and to keep yourself unstained from the world, and he said, "You know, I look around this room and I see people who actually do this. I see Margaret making coffee before dawn. I see David and Maria opening their home every afternoon. I see Earl driving to the prison every Thursday. I see James working his land and giving half his harvest to families who cannot afford groceries. This is not a sermon I need to preach to you. This is a sermon you are already living. I just want to remind you that God sees it, and He is pleased." 40 people in a tiny church in the middle of nowhere, and more of them were living out their faith in tangible, daily, unglamorous ways than the entire 2,000-member congregation I had been part of in Seattle. No one was filming it for social media. No one was tracking engagement metrics. No one was building a brand. They were just loving people, quietly, consistently, without an audience. And something about the sheer, stubborn authenticity of it began to work on me like water on stone. Slow, persistent, impossible to ignore. I did not pray that night. I did not open my Bible. But for the first time in 10 years, I went to bed without the familiar knot of cynicism in my chest. And I slept. I actually slept straight through until morning. That had not happened in years. Kansas weather does not give you much warning. That is what the locals told me, and I believed them in theory, but I did not fully understand it until the night the sky turned green. It was a Wednesday, my 12th day in Millbrook. The afternoon had been warm and thick, the air heavy with moisture, the clouds building in the west like a slow-moving army. I was in the church installing the new projector mount when my phone buzzed with a weather alert. Tornado warning. Seek shelter immediately. Within 20 minutes, the church parking lot was full. Not because Pastor Tom had sent out a message. Not because someone had organized an emergency protocol. People just came. That is what they did in Millbrook when the sky looked wrong. They came to the church because it had the only proper basement in that part of town. And because when you are scared, you go to the place where your people are. 37 people crowded into the church basement that night. Margaret had, somehow, already started a pot of coffee, even though she had arrived only moments before. Earl had blankets. Maria had a bag of snacks for the children. Pastor Tom had flashlights and a battery-powered radio. It was like they had rehearsed this, but they had not. They had just lived it enough times to know what was needed without being told. The children were scared. You could see it in their faces. The way their eyes went wide at every rumble of thunder, the way they pressed close to their parents or to whichever adult was nearest. One of the older women, a widow named Dorothy, gathered 4 of the smallest children around her and began singing softly. "Jesus loves me, this I know." Simple, ancient, a song I had known since before I could read. And hearing it sung in that dim basement while the wind screamed above us, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not faith exactly, not yet, but the memory of faith, the ghost of it. The way your body remembers a song your mind has tried to forget. The storm was bad. The power went out. The building creaked and groaned. Through the small basement windows, we could see debris, flying branches, pieces of fencing, things I could not identify tumbling through the darkness. Pastor Tom prayed. Not a performance prayer. Not a polished, eloquent, stage-ready prayer. He prayed the way a man prays when he is genuinely afraid and genuinely believes someone is listening. "Lord, protect us. Protect our town. We trust you. We are yours." That is all he said. And then he sat down and put his arm around his wife and waited. I was sitting on the floor against the concrete wall, my knees pulled up, trying to control my breathing, when I felt a small body settle in next to me. I looked down and saw a boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, brown hair falling over his forehead, big eyes, a Spider-Man t-shirt that was slightly too big for him. I had seen him around the church. His name was Caleb. His mother, a young woman named Jenny, was a single mom who worked at the diner on Main Street. Caleb came to the church with Maria and the other kids most afternoons. He was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from growing up in a house where quiet kept you safe. He sat next to me and did not say anything for a while. We just sat there, side by side, listening to the storm. Then, without looking at me, in a voice so small I almost missed it under the sound of the wind, he said, "Mr. Alex, do you still talk to Jesus?" The question hit me like a physical thing, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed. I looked down at this little boy sitting next to me in a storm, and I could not lie to him. I could not give him a churchy answer. I could not perform faith I did not have. Not for a child who would know, the way children always know, if I was faking. "No, buddy," I said. "I stopped talking to him a long time ago." Caleb was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he looked up at me with those big eyes and asked, "Did he walk away too?" I could not speak. I physically could not form words. Because that question, that simple, devastating, perfect question from a 6-year-old boy in a Spider-Man shirt, cut through every intellectual defense, every rational argument, every carefully constructed wall I had built over 10 years, and went straight to the core of the wound I had been carrying since I was 19. Did he walk away too? Because that was the real question, was it not? That was the question underneath all the anger and all the cynicism and all the years of telling myself I did not believe. I was not really angry at God for what those church leaders did. I was terrified that God had never been there in the first place, that I had been talking to an empty room, that the presence I thought I felt during all those years of worship was just emotion, just neurochemistry, just the predictable response of a lonely teenager's brain to music and community and the illusion of a father who would never leave. Did he walk away too? I looked at Caleb and I said the most honest thing I had said in 10 years. "I do not know, buddy. I really do not know." Caleb nodded. Then he leaned his head against my arm and said, "I do not think he did. He does not seem like the walking away type." And then he closed his eyes. Like that settled it. Like the theology of a 6-year-old boy, God does not seem like the walking away type, was sufficient to resolve the question and allow sleep. The storm raged for another 2 hours. The church survived. The town survived. Mostly. Some fences were down. A barn on the edge of town had lost its roof. Power lines were tangled across several roads. But no one was hurt. When we finally climbed out of the basement into the gray, wet dawn, the air smelled clean in a way that only air after a storm can smell. Like the world had been scrubbed. Like everything dirty and cluttered and suffocating had been stripped away, and what was left was just the bare, honest earth. I helped with cleanup that morning. Everyone did. The whole town was out, hauling branches, checking on neighbors, sharing generators and food. Pastor Tom was in his jeans and work boots, chainsawing a fallen tree that was blocking the road. He did not delegate it. He did not supervise it from a distance. He just picked up a chainsaw and got to work. And all day, through every blister and every aching muscle and every load of debris I carried, Caleb's question echoed in my head. Did he walk away too? That night, alone in the guest cottage, I sat on the edge of my bed. The power was still out. I had a single candle burning on the desk. And for the first time in 10 years, I spoke out loud into the darkness. I did not pray exactly. I did not know how anymore. I just said, "Are you there?" No answer. No burning bush. No audible voice. No dramatic sign. Just the flicker of the candle. The sound of crickets outside. The smell of rain washed her through the open window. And the smallest, quietest, most fragile sense that maybe I was not talking to an empty room. I blew out the candle. I lay down. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, I heard Caleb's voice again, clear as a bell. He does not seem like the walking away type. I slept. And for the first time in years, I did not dream about the church I lost. I dreamed about a field. An endless field of wheat, golden in the sun, and someone walking toward me from very far away. I could not see the face. But I was not afraid. The morning after the storm, the church needed more cleanup than the town did. Water had leaked through 2 places in the roof, and the sanctuary had that damp, unsettled smell of a space that had been violated by weather. Pastor Tom asked if I would help him move some of the older furniture and supplies out of the areas that had gotten wet so they could dry properly. We spent the morning hauling things. Old folding tables, boxes of donated clothes waiting for distribution, stacks of bulletins from services going back years apparently. No one at Grace Fellowship had ever thrown away a bulletin. And hymnals. Stacks and stacks of hymnals. These were not the sleek, modern songbooks you find in larger churches. These were old, cloth-bound, some of them held together with tape. They had that specific smell of aging paper and binding glue that is either wonderful or terrible depending on your relationship with old books. I have always loved it. I was carrying a stack from the back pew to a dry area near the front when one of them slipped from my hands and hit the floor. It fell open, and something fluttered out from between the pages. A piece of paper, folded, yellowed with age. I set the stack down and picked it up. It was a letter, handwritten in blue ink on lined paper, the kind torn from a composition notebook. The handwriting was neat but slightly shaky, the way handwriting gets when someone is old or emotional or both. I should have set it aside. I should have given it to Pastor Tom. It was not mine. It was not addressed to me. But something that had been nudging me since I arrived in Millbrook. The same something that would not let me turn my rental car around on the highway. The same something that kept me awake at night and made me say those 2 words into the darkness. Are you there? That something made me unfold it and read it. The letter was dated November 14th, 20 years ago. It was written by a man named Robert Hale. And within 3 sentences, I had to sit down. "Dear whoever finds this," it began. "I'm writing this because I do not know who else to tell, and I need someone to know, even if it is a stranger, even if it is years from now. I came to this church broken. I was a worship leader in Kansas City. Big church, thousands of people. I thought I was serving God, but I was serving an institution that did not serve anyone but itself. When I found out the truth about what was happening behind the scenes, the lies, the money, the sin that nobody wanted to talk about, I spoke up. And they threw me away like garbage, like I was the problem. For 5 years after that, I did not go to church. I did not pray. I barely believed in God. I was angry. I was hurt. I was lost. I wondered. I drank too much. I let my marriage almost fall apart. I was so full of bitterness that it poisoned everything I touched. Then, by circumstances I still cannot fully explain, I ended up in Millbrook. I came to fix a broken furnace at the church. That is all. A handyman job. And these people, these simple, loving, stubborn people, they would not let me leave without feeding me. And then they would not let me leave without inviting me to Sunday service. And then they would not let me leave at all. They loved me back to life. I did not want them to. I fought it. I resisted. I told myself I was done with church, done with Christians, done with God. But they did not love me the way the big church loved me, with conditions, with expectations, with strings attached to my usefulness. They loved me the way the Bible says to love, freely, without agenda, without needing anything in return. It took 2 years. 2 years of Margaret's coffee and Earl's handshake and Pastor Harold's patient, unpolished sermons. 2 years of watching people live their faith instead of performing it. 2 years of thawing. And one Sunday morning, I was sitting in the back pew, the very pew where I am placing this letter, and the congregation was singing Amazing Grace, and I heard my own voice joining in, and I realized I was crying, and I realized I believed again. Not the way I believed before. Not the naive, untested, shiny faith of someone who has never been hurt. This was different. This was a faith forged in fire. A faith that had stared into the worst of what the church could do and still found, underneath all the human failure, a God who had never left. I'm writing this letter and hiding it in this hymnal because I want someone to find it someday. Maybe someone like me. Maybe someone who walked away and cannot find their way back. If that is you, I want you to know something. God did not hurt you. People did. Broken, flawed, selfish people who misused His name and His authority for their own purposes. And I know that feels like the same thing. I know it is hard to separate the God from the people who claim to speak for Him. But they are not the same. They were never the same. And if a stubborn, broken, bitter old furnace repairman can find his way back to faith in a tiny church in the middle of nowhere, then so can you. You are not too far gone. You are not too damaged. You are not too angry. God is patient. He will wait. He is very good at waiting. Yours in imperfect faith, Robert Hale. I sat in that pew for a very long time after reading that letter. I do not know how long. I lost track. The light from the plane windows shifted from morning to midday and I did not move. It was like reading my future, written before I was even born. Every word of that letter could have come from my own hand. The big church, the worship leading, the betrayal, the 5 years, no, 10, in my case, of wandering, the anger, the bitterness, the slow death of belief, and the tiny church, and the people who would not let you leave, and the love that came without conditions. I was shaking, not from cold, not from fear, from the overwhelming, terrifying, undeniable sense that this was not an accident. That finding this letter, in this hymnal, in this church, in this town, at this exact moment in my life, was not coincidence. It was orchestrated by someone who had been watching my 10-year detour with a patience I could not comprehend. By someone who had placed a letter in a hymnal 2 decades before I would need to read it, because he knew I would be here. He knew I would be sitting in this pew. He knew I would need these exact words at this exact moment. I held that letter against my chest and I wept. Not quietly, not with dignity. I wept like a child. Like the 19-year-old boy who had walked out of his church and never looked back. Like the man who had spent a decade pretending he did not miss God when the truth was that missing God was the only constant in his life. I wept until there was nothing left. And when I was finally empty, finally hollowed out, finally stripped of every pretense and every defense and every lie I had told myself about being fine, I heard something, not with my ears, deeper, in the place where Caleb's question had lodged itself like an arrow. A still, small voice. The same voice I had heard at 15 with a guitar in my hands and tears on my face. And the absolute certainty that I was loved by a God who would never abandon me. "Welcome back," it said. "I have been waiting for you." I pressed Robert Hale's letter to my heart. And for the first time in 10 years, I said the word God. Just the word. Just the name. Like a first breath after nearly drowning. God. I did not become a believer again overnight. I want to be honest about that because I think the church sometimes pressures people to have neat, clean, instantaneous transformation stories, And that pressure is part of what drives wounded people away. What happened to me in that sanctuary with Robert Hale's letter in my hands was not the end of my journey. It was the beginning of a new one. The walls I had built over 10 years did not collapse all at once. They cracked. They shifted. Light began to come through. But the demolition was slow, and it was messy, and it hurt in ways I was not prepared for. The morning after I found the letter, I went to Pastor Tom's office. It was a tiny room desk, 2 chairs, a bookshelf overflowing with commentaries and paperbacks, a window that looked out onto the parking lot. He was sitting at his desk reading when I knocked. He looked up, took one look at my face, and closed his book. "Sit down, Alex," he said. And I sat down, and I told him everything. Everything. The megachurch, Pastor David, the affair, the money, the elder who told me to cover the nakedness of my father, the 10 years of running, the insomnia, the emptiness, the notebook I found in my drawer, Sarah's phone call, Caleb's question, Robert Hale's letter. I talked for 45 minutes without stopping. And Pastor Tom did not interrupt me once. He did not nod along in that practiced pastoral way. He did not furrow his brow or tilt his head or make sympathetic sounds at the right moments. He just listened, actually listened, with his whole body, with his whole attention. When I was finished, I said the thing I had been most afraid to say, the thing that felt like the most dangerous admission I could make. I do not know what I believe anymore. The words hung in the air between us. In my old church, those words would have been met with alarm, with a lecture, with a 5-step plan for getting your faith back on track, with a prayer that was really a sermon disguised as a conversation with God. Pastor Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "That is okay," he said. "God can handle your doubts. He is not fragile, Alex. He is not threatened by your questions. He is not pacing around heaven wringing his hands because Alex Miller is not sure what he believes. He already knows what you believe. He already knows what you do not. And he is still here." And then he said, "But can I tell you one thing?" I nodded. "Do not deconstruct alone. That is the mistake. Not the questioning. The questioning is healthy. The questioning is necessary. Faith that has never been tested is not faith, it is just habit. But when you deconstruct alone, in isolation, with no community, no voices of wisdom, no one who loves you enough to sit with you in the mess, that is when deconstruction becomes destruction. That is when you do not just take apart the broken things. You take apart everything. Even the things that were true. Even the things that were keeping you alive." I heard those words and I knew in my bones that he was describing exactly what I had done. I had deconstructed alone. I had taken apart my faith in a sealed room with no windows and no help. And I had lost the ability to tell the difference between the things that needed to go and the things that were worth keeping. The hypocrisy of my old church needed to go. The belief that leaders are infallible needed to go. The performance-driven, personality-centered, smoke machine faith needed to go. But God did not need to go. Jesus did not need to go. The truth of the gospel that I am broken and loved and offered grace I did not earn, that did not need to go. I threw it all out. Baby and bathwater and tub and plumbing and the whole house. Because I was alone. And alone. Everything looks the same color. Everything looks like a lie. That week was the most difficult and the most important of my life. I spent hours with Pastor Tom, not in formal counseling sessions, just talking, walking the gravel roads around the church, sitting on the tailgate of his truck watching the sun set over the fields. He did not give me answers. He gave me permission to ask questions. He did not pressure me to pray or to read the Bible or to recommit or to come forward for an altar call. He just walked beside me and let me process at my own speed. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, things began to come back into focus. Not all at once. In pieces. A verse I remembered and felt something when I read it again. A hymn I hummed without thinking and then realized I was humming. A moment during a sunset when the beauty of the world felt so excessive, so unnecessary, so gratuitously generous, that the idea of a creator seemed not just possible but obvious. On my last Sunday in Millbrook, the morning before I was scheduled to fly back to Seattle, I walked into the sanctuary for the worship service. The new projector was mounted and working. The new laptop was set up. The new sound system, modest but functional, was ready. I had done what I came to do. The technical job was finished. But God's job was not. Pastor Tom had asked me earlier in the week if I would consider doing something during the service. I had said no. Then he asked again on Saturday, and I said I would think about it. And on Sunday morning, I said yes. And that is how I found myself standing at the front of a 40-person church in rural Kansas, holding a guitar for the first time in 10 years. My hands were shaking. My fingers had lost their calluses years ago, and the strings bit into soft skin. I could feel every eye in the room on me. Margaret, Earl, James, Maria, Dorothy, Jenny and Caleb, Sarah, standing to the side with tears already streaming. Pastor Tom, sitting in the front pew with his Bible on his knee and a small, steady smile. I opened my mouth and I was not sure anything would come out. 10 years of silence is a long time. 10 years of refusing to sing, refusing to worship, refusing to acknowledge the existence of the one I was supposed to be singing to. But the first note came, shaky, thin, imperfect. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. And then the second line, stronger now, because Margaret's voice had joined mine. Her old, cracked, beautiful voice, the voice that had been singing hymns in this church for over 50 years. I once was lost, but now am found. More voices. Earl's baritone, James's tentative tenor, children's voices, high and clear and unashamed. Was blind, but now I see. I could not finish. My voice broke on the word see and I stood there, in front of 40 people, with tears pouring down my face and my guitar hanging from my neck. And I could not sing another note. But I did not need to, because they sang it for me. The whole congregation. 40 voices carrying the song I could no longer carry myself. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Grace will lead me home. I stood there with my broken voice and my soft fingers and my 10 years of running. And I let 40 strangers who had become family in less than 3 weeks sing me home. It was not a megachurch moment. There were no lights, no fog, no production, no cameras, no audience of thousands. Just 40 people and an old hymn and the plain afternoon light coming through plain windows. In a plain building in a plain town that God had been preparing as my rescue for longer than I had been alive. I flew back to Seattle on a Monday afternoon. The flight from Kansas City was 3.5 hours, and I spent every minute of it staring out the window at the clouds below, thinking about the fact that 3 weeks ago I had flown in the opposite direction as a man who did not believe in God, and now I was flying home as a man who was not sure what he believed, exactly, but who knew with a certainty that transcended logic or argument or proof that he was not alone, that he had never been alone, that even in the darkest, most silent years, when he had slammed every door and locked every window and built walls so thick that no light could penetrate, there had been someone on the other side of those walls, waiting, patient, never once walking away. Caleb was right. He does not seem like the walking away type. Seattle looked different when I landed. The same gray sky, the same rain, the same traffic, the same apartment. But I was not the same person who had left it, and so everything I looked at was filtered through different eyes. I did not quit my job. I did not sell everything and move to Kansas. I did not have some cinematic, dramatic, burn the ships moment of total transformation. Real life is not a movie, and real faith does not require you to become a different person overnight. What I did was simpler than that, and harder. I started being honest with myself, with others, with God. I started praying again. Not eloquent prayers, not the kind of prayers I used to pray on stage with a microphone in front of 2,000 people. Small prayers, clumsy prayers, prayers that sounded more like conversations with someone I was just getting to know again after a long separation. Prayers like, I do not understand you, but I think you are real, and I think you have been chasing me, and I am tired of running. I found a small church in Seattle, not a megachurch, a small community that met in a rented school gymnasium. 70 people, no production, no brand, a pastor who worked a second job during the week because the church could not afford to pay him full-time. It was not perfect. No church is. I know that now in a way I could not have known at 19. No church is perfect because no church is made of perfect people, but imperfect is not the same as fake. Broken is not the same as fraudulent, and a community of flawed humans trying honestly to follow Jesus is worth infinitely more than a polished institution that has forgotten what it means to serve anyone but itself. I also started doing something I never expected to do. I started talking about my story. At first, just with a few people. A friend from work who had confided that she had left her faith years ago and sometimes missed it. A guy at a coffee shop who noticed my guitar case and asked if I played at church. Small conversations, honest conversations, no agenda, no pressure, just one person telling another, I was hurt. I walked away, and I found my way back, and the response I got was overwhelming. Not because my story was special, because it was common, because there are millions of people walking around right now carrying the same wound I carried. Church hurt, spiritual abuse, betrayal by leaders they trusted, the devastating experience of discovering that the people who claimed to represent God were using God's name to serve themselves. And most of those people did exactly what I did. They walked away. They deconstructed alone. They threw out the baby with the bathwater. And they are living right now in that same gray space I lived in for 10 years, not quite believing, not quite disbelieving, unable to go back to what was, unable to find what should be, just existing in a painful limbo that looks like freedom from the outside but feels like exile from the inside. I started creating content for those people. Videos, written pieces, conversations, not preaching. I am not a preacher. I am a guy who got hurt and ran away and got found by a God who used a tornado and a 6-year-old's question and a dead man's letter to bring him home. That is my only qualification. And it is enough. Because the people who are hurting do not need another sermon. They need someone who looks them in the eye or speaks to them through a screen and says, I know how bad it is. I know how the betrayal sits in your stomach like poison. I know how the anger feels righteous at first and then just feels empty. I know how the loneliness of being outside the faith you grew up in can feel like being exiled from your own identity. I know. And I also know this. God is not the same as his broken followers. Jesus is not the institution that misused his name. The gospel is not the building that housed the abuse. And walking away from a toxic church is not the same as walking away from God. Even though it feels like it. Even though the pain makes everything blur together into one undifferentiated mass of hurt that you cannot sort through because sorting through it means touching it again. And you cannot bear to touch it again. I understand. But I am asking you to try not to go back to the place that hurt you. Never go back to a place that hurt you and refuses to change. But go somewhere new. Somewhere small. Somewhere the pastor makes coffee and the people bring casserole dishes for strangers. And an old man drives 45 minutes every Thursday to sit with prisoners because somebody once sat with him. Those places exist. They are not on billboards. They do not have podcasts with millions of downloads. They do not show up in your Instagram feed. But they are there. Scattered across this country like wildflowers in a field. Small, stubborn, beautiful outposts of actual faith. And they will not fix you overnight. They will not erase the hurt. But they will sit with you in it. And that, I have learned, is what the church was always supposed to be. Not a show. Not a brand. Not a machine. Just people sitting with people in the storm. Just voices carrying the song when your voice gives out. Just grace. Ordinary, unpolished, relentless grace. I still have Robert Hale's letter. I carry it in my Bible, the same leather-bound NIV my mom gave me when I was 14. The one I finally opened again that night in the guest cottage by candlelight. The letter is folded and worn, and I read it whenever the old doubts creep in. Whenever the cynicism tries to rebuild its walls. Whenever I hear about another church scandal and feel the familiar twist in my stomach. I read it and I remember that my story is not unique. That people have been hurt by the church and found their way back for as long as the church has existed. That the church has always been broken because it is made of broken people. And that God, somehow, insists on working through the brokenness anyway. Because that is who he is. A God who works through cracks. A God who hides letters in hymnals. A God who speaks through children in storms. A God who sends stubborn old women to make coffee before dawn for 31 years. A God who waits 10 years for a prodigal to stop running. A God who does not walk away. If you are watching this right now, and your story sounds anything like mine, I want to tell you something. Something that Robert Hale wrote 2 decades before I needed to hear it, and that I am now saying to you. However, many years before or after you need to hear it. You are not too far gone. You are not too damaged. You are not too angry. You are not too deconstructed. Your story is not finished. God is patient. He will wait. He is very, very good at waiting. And whenever you are ready, whenever you find the courage to whisper into the darkness, are you there? I believe with everything in me that you will hear what I heard. Welcome back. I have been waiting for you.